Across Australia and Spain, the land is thirsty, and farmers are left staring at empty reservoirs. In boardrooms, experts debate how to share water fairly while the crisis deepens. Farmers and communities are trying new ways to save water, but the challenge is enormous. With teamwork and better laws, there's hope for a future where water flows again.
Welcome everyone, once again to The Rule Beyond. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce what may be our most special episode yet. We've come all the way to Perth, to the University of Western Australia, to discuss one of the most pressing yet overlooked issues of our time: water. To help us explore this topic, we've invited two of the most recognizable experts from countries where water law is not just relevant, but critical. To your left, from Australia, Emeritus Professor Alex Gardner, a leading voice in environmental law. Professor Gardner has been a teaching research and legal consultant on environmental and water issues for over 3 decades. To your right, from Spain, Estanislao Arana García, full professor at the University of Granada, director of the master's degree in water law, and academic director of the Water Economics Forum. Today's theme: water, law, and climate change. Professors Gardner and Arana, thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure.
Well, I would like to begin with this spark. So, in your country, what events or crises brought water access and climate into public or legal debate recently? Stanislao.
Buenas tardes y bueno, en primer lugar quiero darte las gracias, Cristóbal, por tu iniciativa y por la invitación a participar en este proyecto que me parece muy interesante y que seguro que en el futuro será muy conocido e importante. Siguiendo con tu pregunta, podríamos decir que en un país como España, donde el agua tradicionalmente en gran parte de su territorio ha escaseado, siempre ha estado en el debate social. El agua es muy importante y la sociedad, lógicamente, se ha ocupado de ese problema. Sin embargo, no se ha preocupado todo lo que a los que nos dedicamos al mundo del agua probablemente nos gustaría. Y ha tenido que ser cuando se han producido situaciones de extrema escasez o situaciones de inundaciones, por ejemplo, cuando la sociedad realmente ha tomado conciencia del problema del agua. Me refiero a la gran sequía que hemos padecido en los últimos 10 años y de la que todavía no hemos salido en la actualidad, y también situaciones de inundaciones. Desgraciadamente, la más importante, la más virulenta, tuvo lugar hace 2 años en Valencia, la famosa Dana de Valencia, que causó más de 200 muertos y más de millones de euros en pérdidas materiales. Son 2 desgraciadas situaciones que han puesto el agua de máxima actualidad, 2 situaciones sobre las que también podríamos haber actuado mejor, tanto en el plano preventivo como en el plano reactivo. Podríamos haber sido mejores previendo estas situaciones y también podríamos haber sido mejores atajando sus consecuencias.
Muchas gracias. Professor Gardner.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
It's a pleasure.
It wasn't so much a spark as sparks over decades. So we should begin by recognising that water law in Australia is mainly state law. Until 14 years ago, there wasn't really any national water law. So by the early 1990s, a number of the Australian states were beginning to recognise scarcity of water resources. So in 1994, all the state governments and the national government made a new national water policy. Interestingly, this policy was part of what was called national competition policy. So it was seen as part of economic reform. And the idea was to deliver a more market-oriented system of water resources management and water services delivery. I think we can understand the difference between those two. Now that seemed to go okay for a while, but the millennium drought, which I could possibly date from 1998 to 2009, was the big spark. So particularly on the East Coast and in the Southeast, there was a growing awareness of climate change. State governments regulated both commercial uses of water and urban residential uses. So there were, limits on water use. And they began to build desalination plants. So in 2004, there was a reform of the national water policy, which enhanced the model of the reforms, better defined them. Even so, by 2006, the millennium drought was so severe and the states were so slow to reform their laws in accordance with national policy that the national government stepped in and enacted the first National Water Act. And it was mainly aimed at the Murray-Darling Basin. Because these were transboundary rivers, any single state could not adequately regulate the system. And the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, which was sort of a cooperative process, was no longer sufficiently working. Now, I think that's probably as much as I could say about those sparks.
Thank you very much. So we've seen that water isn't just a natural resource. It's becoming a political fault line. So let's dig a little bit into the law behind it. In Spain, access to water is governed by the principle of immutability. Could you please explain what that means in practice and why it's so deeply rooted in the Spanish legal tradition, Stanislao?
Y tenemos ahora prácticamente en casi todos los lugares la idea de que el agua, el consenso de que el agua es un bien público. En nuestro caso, una técnica traída del derecho francés, es un bien de dominio público, es una propiedad pública para entendernos. Pero el hecho de que el agua sea un bien público, un bien de dominio público, no significa que no se pueda aprovechar por los particulares. El agua está para ser aprovechada individualmente para diferentes usos. Y ¿cómo entonces se articula esa relación? Pues lógicamente la administración es la dueña del agua y los particulares la pueden aprovechar con la correspondiente autorización administrativa o concesión administrativa, que es como técnicamente se conoce en nuestro derecho. Son títulos habilitantes que la administración titular del dominio público cede a los particulares para diferentes usos consultivos. Tradicionalmente, esos títulos habilitantes se otorgaban a los particulares por un largo periodo de tiempo, una concesión por un periodo largo de tiempo que lógicamente suponían un aumento en el patrimonio del titular de ese título porque tenía un derecho de acceder a un determinado volumen y para un determinado uso de un bien escaso como es el agua, como digo, de una manera estable y segura. Están siendo objeto esos títulos habilitantes de unas alteraciones que en otros momentos no daban lugar, salvo que se hiciera con la correspondiente indemnización. Los tribunales de justicia en España están admitiendo que por razones ambientales, por ejemplo, caudales ecológicos u otro tipo de limitaciones, los derechos privados, los títulos habilitantes que otorgaban derechos sobre el agua, puedan verse reducidos incluso sin compensación. Ese es quizás a lo que te estabas refiriendo con la alteración del principio de inmutabilidad de los títulos habilitantes sobre el agua y que ahora está cambiando.
De acuerdo. Australia, by contrast, has moved toward market mechanisms. What's the rationale behind enabling the trade of water rights and how is it structured legally, Alex?
So in this, I think Australia is possibly a leading model. It's certainly gained a lot of attention. The primary rationale for transitioning to tradable water rights was economic efficiency in the allocation and reallocation of water access rights. So that is the right to access the natural resource. So a key aim was to facilitate the distribution of water access rights to the most economically valuable use of the water. Under the previous sort of highly regulated bureaucratic system. There were shorter term water licenses, which could be renewed and renewed, but not a great facility for changing or redistributing the water rights. Those who wanted water for a new project would approach government. But if the water was not there, what did that person do? What did that applicant do? So by facilitating trade, you enabled greater dynamism amongst the industries that used water resources. Now, this also included the public agencies. Okay. Now, one of the first changes was to break up the state government monopoly agencies that provided both the water services, so that's drinking water supply, sewerage and drainage, and also regulated the private persons who wanted water rights. So you can see a conflict of interest there. The public agency is saying, well, we may want that water for our public water supply. So those agencies were broken up, and there were three sort of agencies that came out. The Water Resources Regulator, who can gain a grant of a license or entitlement to use the water, both private and public. Then the Water Services Provider, the water utilities providing the water services, and then the Services Regulator. So those who wanted to provide water services had to obtain a water services license. Now, the idea was that the new private entities who may wish to become private water service providers would be on a level playing field. Every water service provider, public or private, would have to play by the same rules. That was the theory. In reality, there's very little water service provision in Australia by private enterprises. Some other countries have got significant private delivery, but not in Australia. So the second key aim then was the water resource regulation. And the idea was to balance the development of the water market with the securing of water for the environment, because there was recognition of over-allocation, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin. So at first, this was to be done by making water allocation plans, sometimes called water sharing plans. And those plans would set environmentally sustainable levels of extraction, and then provide rules for converting the old short-term water licenses into perpetual water access entitlements. Right? So like a land holding interest, if you own your land, there's no limit on your ownership. The same with the perpetual water access entitlement. There would also be, however, a process of annual allocation. So each year, assessing under the rules in a plan, how much water is available for consumptive use. That's your consumptive pool. And that water would then be shared out to the water access entitlement holders. You may or may not get your full expected entitlement. So what if there was a drier year? Who gets more water? There were different levels of security or reliability in the entitlements. So town water supply, water utilities, they would have high security water. Orchardists, they needed to keep their trees alive. They would have high security entitlements. But those who maybe had other industrial uses, manufacturing, or perhaps annual crops, it was called general, or you might say low security. And some years, a very dry year, the general security licensees, they might get no water, or only 30% or 20% of what they expected. This is where the trade became important. If the orchardists still didn't get their full entitlement, they could go and buy water from their neighbours who may have the general security entitlement. Or the water utility might buy in water from industry. So it gave greater flexibility for distributing water according to water availability. There were two other institutions that are quite important. Victoria and the national government have established the environmental water holder. So this is particularly applicable where you have reservoirs. And the environmental water holder would hold an entitlement in the reservoir, and they may or may not want to use it. If they didn't need to release that water in a wet year, they might sell it to another party and earn the money so that later in a dry year, they could buy a water entitlement and release more water from the reservoir for the environment. So it gave, again, greater flexibility for the distribution of the water. The other institution was the market regulator. So most markets around the world have bad actors, some people who don't play according to the rules. So it is with the water market. So the National Competition the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission was the market regulator. They took on the role of regulating the water market.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So two very different philosophies, one rooted in stability, the other in flexibility. But beneath the legal language lies a deeper tension. So Stanislaw, what is really at stake in this debate? Is it about sovereignty over natural resources, environmental survival, or economic modernization?
El agua y su gobernanza es un juego de equilibrios. Ahí está su complicación. Tenemos que ser capaces de distribuir un recurso escaso, como es el agua, entre los muchos usos que requieren ese elemento, empezando por el abastecimiento a poblaciones, pero también, por supuesto, al mayor consumidor de agua, que es la agricultura, la industria, la energía, la tecnología, y tenemos que repartir el poco agua que hay entre todos esos usos de manera que resulten compatibles. Pero además se ha añadido un nuevo actor, que es el medio ambiente. El medio ambiente se convierte en un nuevo uso, aunque técnicamente no sea así concebido, y también hay que atender a este nuevo usuario. El medio ambiente necesita o requiere, demanda también, hay que incluirlo en ese reparto de agua, siempre y cuando se haga de una manera justa, razonable y proporcionada. Porque lo que tenemos que tener claro es que la seguridad hídrica es fundamental, es un elemento esencial. Pero no solo de seguridad hídrica vive el hombre necesita también seguridad alimentaria, seguridad energética, necesita establecer una serie de medidas que permitan el reparto de agua de una manera justa y equilibrada, en la proporción que resulte razonable. Esa es la dificultad de la gobernanza del agua, un justo equilibrio entre consumidores, entre el medio ambiente y entre el desarrollo económico.
Thank you very much. What about Australia, Mr. Gardner?
So, sovereignty. For the Murray-Darling Basin states, who were used to regulating water resources themselves, they may have had concerns about a national government coming in and setting limits on what they were doing. But I think the Murray-Darling Basin scheme and the Basin Plan is mostly now accepted by the community and the states. They realise the importance of having an overall basin plan. There are still conflicts, of course. The New South Wales irrigators don't want their entitlements reduced in order to see more water flow to South Australia.
Yes.
But there's a framework for that debate and decision making. Within Western Australia, the other side of the country, the resistance to reform, I think, comes mainly from those who argue for economic development. And historically, Western Australia said, well, the Murray-Darling Basin may be over-allocated, but we are not. Now, I think that's no longer true, but there's also the mining industry in Western Australia. They are big users of water. By the way, Western Australia is possibly the largest mining jurisdiction in the world. with huge mines. A big use of water, though, is what we call mine dewatering. To mine below the groundwater table, you have to extract the groundwater, and that dries out the landscape. For some, the attraction of the mining industry profits are very strong, including for the government. The government earns a lot of revenue from the mining industry, from authorising mining. But for others, there's a conflict, the impact on indigenous interests in those areas being mined. There's also growing competition for water between the mining industry and agriculture and those concerned about the environment and business interests, the tourism businesses.
Well, thank you very much. It was really enlightening because maybe the mining industry is not the first that comes up to mind when we think about influencing in water and everything. So
the influence of the mining industry on water and environmental regulation in Western Australia is enormous.
Great. Well, let's widen a little bit the lens. These are national stories, but they echo global patterns. Are there countries you look to, either as cautionary tales or as sources of inspiration when thinking about water law and climate? Stanislaw?
Sorry. Modestamente, creo que España tiene una larga historia y exitosa historia. La autoridad, digamos, el ejemplo de autoridad administrativa única del agua a nivel estatal son las confederaciones hidrográficas, que el próximo año, en 2026, cumpliremos el centenario de su creación, es decir, la va a cumplir próximamente. Pero lógicamente no nos podemos quedar en una historia de éxito y tenemos que mirar alrededor para aprender de otros lugares. Por ejemplo, tenemos mucho que aprender de Australia en este sistema, por ejemplo, de los mercados del agua, o Dinamarca, que es un país donde no tienen un problema de cantidad de agua, sus ciudadanos pagan 3 veces más que un español por el uso del agua urbana. Al margen de las diferencias económicas entre un país y otro, la cuestión no es solo esa, es una cuestión de que el ciudadano danés está más concienciado de lo que valen los servicios relacionados con el agua, de lo que cuesta especialmente la labor de saneamiento del agua y de la devolución del agua a la naturaleza, y son capaces de pagar mucho más de lo que paga un ciudadano español que tiene encima un problema de escasez de agua. Hay que hacer pedagogía con el agua. Cualquier ciudadano español le preguntas por cuánto paga de agua y lo que te dice que paga mucho. Sin embargo, si tú miras realmente lo que se paga por el agua, en España se paga, el esfuerzo para pagar el recibo del agua representa 1/3 menos de lo que representa el recibo de la luz o el recibo de las telecomunicaciones o de la telefonía móvil. Y no tenemos conciencia los ciudadanos de que estemos pagando exageradamente por esos servicios, por ejemplo la telefonía, y sí con el agua. Hace falta mucha pedagogía y aprender de otros países donde esto se hace mejor.
Muchas gracias. Professor? Absolutamente. And speaking about Australia, Professor Gardner, what's your view on this?
So, Australian water law has gained much from its English origins, and I'll explain that briefly, and also some early inspirations from American water. So those two traditions come through. But beyond that, I have to say, Australian water law has developed so much in the last 30 years. We tend to think of our model as a leading global model, and we don't tend to look at the models of other countries that much, other than to see dry lakes or dry riverbeds.
That makes sense.
However, can I just expand a little bit about the relevance perhaps of EU law? I think we have lessons to gain from the protection of water quality, particularly when it comes to pollutants from agriculture or things like that. So the framework directive about water quality, I think, could give us a lot of new information.
All right. Yes, comparing systems is really helpful, but ultimately, laws shape lives. So I wanted to ask you if you could share with us an example of how the current legal model has affected real people. either if it's positively or negatively, maybe a farmer, a community, a region in your country?
El agua está presente permanentemente en nuestra vida, desde que nos levantamos hasta que nos acostamos, desde que nacemos hasta que morimos, y por lo tanto el lado humano del agua está presente de manera continua. Podríamos tener muchos ejemplos de ello. Pero quizás te referías al caso de los agricultores, ¿no? Y pensando en la gobernanza del agua y los agricultores, realmente, los agricultores y no solamente ellos, también el común de los ciudadanos, muchas veces no llegan a comprender el por qué, según ellos, el agua se desaprovecha por el río, dejándola correr por el río y no se puede utilizar para determinados recursos económicos como la agricultura o otras industrias. Otro ejemplo de cómo el agua conmueve socialmente a los ciudadanos o es capaz de movilizarse incluso en muchas ocasiones de manera torticera o populista es el tema de los trasvases, cuando la administración cada vez más excepcionalmente o la planificación hidrológica correspondiente decide que se puede realizar o que es conveniente realizar un trasvase, una transferencia de recursos hídricos de un lugar a otro dentro de la misma cuenca o a veces, muy excepcionalmente, entre diversas cuencas, eso moviliza mucho a la sociedad. Probablemente se utilice políticamente de una manera demagógica, pero realmente eso conmueve a la sociedad porque todavía está en nuestra mentalidad, en nuestra idiosincrasia, el pensamiento de que el agua es propiedad de un determinado territorio. Mientras que principios como el de solidaridad nacional o principios como el de una mayor eficiencia económica en el reparto de ese agua, pues no llegan a calar suficientemente.
Tiene usted razón. And what about Australia, Professor Gardner?
So, water trading, particularly, has been both positive and negative. On the benefit side, a key example is during the Millennium Drought. Water licensees who did annual cropping decided to reduce their activity and sold their water allocations to the orchardists. So the orchardists might have got a lesser allocation than their full allocation. Maybe they didn't have enough water. But if they didn't water their trees, they might lose their trees and not re-establish them for more than a decade. So they could buy water from the annual cropper. The annual cropper doesn't produce the crop, but they still get the income from selling their water. So that was very beneficial. Even the public water utilities could participate in this, perhaps buying from those who didn't need their water that year. The national government also used water trade to buy water access rights for environmental conservation. Now, they've done this so they didn't have to confront the question of reducing entitlements greatly without compensation. So the way to compensate was to enter the market and buy the water rights, I think by a process of reverse auction. The government wants the water, you tell us how much you're willing to sell for, the government accepts the best bids. So that was good as well. There was a benefit in shifting water to environmental allocations. At the same time, those who were selling got some income or some return on their asset, and they might use that for other business purposes in their locality. But here's the negative. Some of those people could take that money and move away. Mm. And so some of the rural communities felt they were losing the water that could be applied to agriculture and other enterprises in their district or in their township. And so that certainly has been seen as a negative for some of those communities. Now, to me, more broadly speaking, that's a global problem. agricultural communities have been diminishing around the world. This is an aspect of how it's happened in Australia.
Okay, so let's, however, step back, because this isn't just about water itself. It's also about democracy, rights, and the future. Do you believe access to water should be framed legally as a human right? And if so, how does that square with the economic or property logic that often governs it?
El derecho humano al agua está ya reconocido a nivel internacional. En Naciones Unidas, en el año 2010, la Asamblea General adoptó la resolución 64-292, que reconoce formalmente el derecho humano al agua potable y al saneamiento como algo esencial para el pleno disfrute de la vida de todos los seres humanos. Siguiendo ese paso dado por Naciones Unidas, muchas constituciones nacionales se han aventurado a reconocer como un derecho fundamental o un derecho humano el derecho al agua. Sin embargo, bajo mi punto de vista, no es lo más importante, tiene un efecto mediático interesante, pero para mí no es lo esencial. De hecho, en muchos de estos estados donde se reconoce el derecho fundamental o el derecho humano al agua en sus constituciones, materialmente no es así. Sin embargo, en estados o en países como el español, donde nuestra Constitución no reconoce el agua como un derecho fundamental o como un derecho humano, es la normativa, la legislación ordinaria desde la década de los 50 del siglo XX el que materialmente ha reconocido el agua como un derecho humano. La legislación local de 1950, de la década de los 50, estableció que el servicio de abastecimiento y saneamiento era un servicio público, obligatorio y demandable por todos los ciudadanos. Materialmente ahí estaba ya reconocido el derecho humano al agua y no hacía falta que la Constitución o una norma meramente programática reconociera el derecho. Derecho humano al agua, sí, está reconocido. ¿Que eso sea lo esencial? No, hay que ver realmente, no quedarnos con una mera declaración programática, sino descender a la realidad y ver cómo se implementa ese derecho fundamental al agua a través de una técnica, por ejemplo, como el servicio público.
So what's the Australian perspective on that?
So, for me, water for commercial activities is not about a human right. There are technological and economic solutions to providing water for those purposes, improving water efficiency, etc. The human right question is for domestic water supply, for ordinary human beings knowing they have safe drinking water and sanitation. In Australia, almost all domestic water supply and sewerage services are provided by state or local government utilities. In Western Australia, it's a state government utility plus two smaller urban water utilities. They have legal duties to supply safe and sufficient water supplies, and they generally do this. There are some exceptions in remote communities. Okay. And those water utilities can also participate in the water market, but they usually hold quite secure entitlements. So the priorities are given to supplying human needs. The real challenge in Western Australia is water recycling. We discharge enormous volumes of water that's been used once and it goes out to the ocean. We also have stormwater systems which, in a sense, drain our landscape and discharge that water to the ocean. We need to develop systems that much better capture and use those water resources. And if we did that, we could afford to make Perth, in a sense, more self-sufficient in its water resources, with less need to take water from other catchments and deprive the environment of environmental flows.
That is a great point, Professor. So, as you both may know, water law is rarely on the front pages, but the consequences are deep and lasting. So, if our listeners only remembered one idea, one concept of this debate, what do you think it should be?
Difícil cuestión, pero bueno, podríamos decir que tenemos que quedarnos con una idea básica y tenemos que conseguir hacer lo mismo con menos agua. Tenemos que hacer más eficiente el sistema para poder hacer lo mismo con menos agua. Tenemos que actuar por el lado de la oferta y por el lado de la demanda. Y siempre, en cualquier caso, cuando hablamos de agua, tenemos que hablar de conciencia pública y educación. Son dos palabras esenciales que deben de regir la gobernanza del agua en el futuro. Hay que tener una mayor conciencia pública de la importancia de este recurso y tenemos que llevar a la educación desde las más tempranas edades de los niños la importancia que tiene el agua. El agua es una responsabilidad de todos.
Muchas gracias. Esperamos que ese mensaje llegue a la ciudadanía. And one final shot,
Sure.
Mr. Gardner.
So, quite briefly, keep in mind the distinction of water for commercial purposes, usually by private entities, and water for human consumption. The former benefits from the water market reforms, so long as you have provision for environmental water allocation. The latter is probably still safer under government control. But here we do need to explore, I'm thinking in the Australian context, we do need to explore more the water recycling. And that needs careful public consultation. That's better with government process.
Great. Well, we've finally come to an end. Thank you both very much for coming here. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And, well, we'll see you the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bueno.
Thank you. Now,